Friends, good evening. A very warm welcome to the Cathedral this evening for this Friends lecture, and a really big welcome back to our speaker, who is Dr. Rowan Williams, former Bishop of this diocese, Archbishop of Wales. We have to get these things in priority order, and then that mere being Archbishop of Canterbury after that, and of course back in Wales after a sojourn in Cambridge, with a previous career in academic life in Oxford and Cambridge, which was inspirational for those of us who've grown up on his books and been inspired by him. It's a delight to welcome Dr. Williams to give a talk this evening, which is going to be on Are We a Secular Society, Christianity and the Contemporary Culture, a timely topic in the midst of a general election about what is the nature of our society and where does Christianity fit in that. I don't know whether I've just now made him panic and say, well, actually, that's not at all what I'm going to do. But if not, it was my mistake and not his. That's the rules of hosting. Mindful of this sacred place going back to its ancient roots with Gwynllw and Gladys in the 5th century, let us begin with a prayer. God of Gwynllw and Gladys, who founded this house of prayer inspired by your call, grant that its life and worship may ever abound to your great glory, and that as friends we may do our part by prayer and offering to strengthen its witness to this diocese and world. We ask this in the power of the Holy Spirit, in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ. Amen. Please give an extremely warm welcome to Dr. Rowan Williams.
Thank you so much for your welcome, and thank you so much for the invitation to be here this evening. I really can't begin to say how delighted I am to be back in this cathedral and in this diocese, which I think I can truly say myself and my family have loved more than any other job we've had in our lives. So, to our business. And it's not a million miles away from what the Dean said it was going to be about, so I can relax a little bit. But it seemed to me that it might be worth attempting, rather ambitiously, an overview of the question of what the place is currently of Christian faith and witness in our society. Are we a secular society? In good academic style, of course, you have to begin by saying it all depends what you mean by secular. But if a secular society is one in which the public visibility of religion has disappeared, we're not quite there yet. We can talk a lot about the cultural decline of religion in general, and then, of course, we catch ourselves up and remember that while Christianity may be in numerical decline, some other religious communities, noticeably Islam, aren't. And the presence of a very overt and visible set of religious commitments in the Muslim community, making certain quite proper demands for recognition and space in our society, is always something which gives pause to those who think we've stopped being religious. And yet, of course, by most of the markers that make sense to us, we're not a Christian society in the way we were 50 years ago. And that change has been a great deal more rapid than most of us would have expected. I think certainly those of us who grew up in Wales in the middle of the 20th century would have been extremely surprised then to be told that by the 3rd decade of the 21st century, Wales would have one of the lowest rates of measurable Christian practice in the United Kingdom. In terms of our numbers, we're not where we were. in terms of our status in society. We're not where we were. In terms of general knowledge about Christianity, we're certainly not where we were. Who was the Good Samaritan? Who was the prodigal son? Who was Moses? Even a well-instructed younger Christian congregation sometimes struggles with this, as I've sometimes found talking to young people, let alone talking in church schools. And that decline in visibility and status and the knowledge of what we're about, of course, has consequent pressures. Is there a case for church schools? Should there be English bishops in the House of Lords? Oughtn't we to be very suspicious of Christian commitment in politics? Oughtn't we to be worried when people with strong and articulate Christian commitment are in positions of influence? The record of Kate Forbes and the SNP in Scotland comes to mind here. So, yes, we are definitely in an era where the Christian presence has changed. It hasn't been eradicated, but its credibility and its leverage are certainly less. And that becomes something of a downward spiral, so we're told. And the pressure from many quarters is to accelerate that downward spiral and make sure that it becomes even less visible than it was. And then, of course, there's the way in which we have, as a church, and have not responded to this challenge, because we have all been so tied up in our internal squabbles in the last few decades. In the eyes of many people in the wider British public, the Christian community is seen as compulsively divided and obsessively concerned about a particular bandwidth of moral issues, mostly to do with sex, with occasional excursions into assisted dying. Or to put it rather differently, if people know anything about Christianity, they're likely to know what we're against. It is not a terribly promising place to start in sharing good news. And in this, we see just a few signs of the Americanization of British culture. To call yourself a Christian in the United States of America, certainly in educated and professional circles, is very often to brand yourself instantly as somebody who has bought into a particular cluster of political and social as well as religious commitments. To be a Christian there is to be automatically associated with the further reaches of the political right. And we see some signs of that association developing in people's minds here, and some signs also, it must be said, of some Christian groups who were really quite relaxed about that happening and wouldn't mind it happening more. Meanwhile, our society will appeal both to the fact of religious plurality in Britain and to the fact of religious indifference as a way of saying that the church no longer has a preemptive right, an expectation to a privileged position or a voice in the public square. And that comes through, of course, in attitudes to traditionally Christian public festivals from time to time. An agenda pressed not so much by the faithful of other religions as by anxious bureaucrats in town halls who don't want to offend anybody. That's the bad news. But that, I suppose, is what most of us are aware of as we look around, digest the media, think about what we remember and what's disappeared. it does feel, in all sorts of important respects, like, let's say, a post-Christian world. But the first major point I want to make this evening is, of course, that post-Christian doesn't mean quite the same thing as secular. Our country is not, in fact, packed to the doors with paid-up disciples of Richard Dawkins. It's not deeply divided about the legitimacy of religious practice. The prevailing climate is something you might more accurately call a kind of wistfulness about Christianity, rather than hostility. We don't see in the United Kingdom the kind of systematic and sometimes violent anti-clericalism that we see in parts of the continent of Europe, especially southern Europe. The active denial of public space to Christian and other religious bodies is still relatively rare in the United Kingdom, though worth keeping an eye on. And perhaps the main way in which this comes across is the surviving need and hunger for a public space in which public grieving and public celebration can still take place. A public space for public grieving and public celebration. Traumatic events in individual lives and in the collective life of a society are still deeply felt, and there is a pressure to find somewhere to deal with those emotions, to deal with those pressures. The churches remain, to a surprising extent, the custodians of that kind of public space. I look back to a couple of events here in this diocese in my time as bishop, remembering one incident in a parish which shall be nameless, where there'd been a very traumatic murder. A young schoolgirl had been killed on her way home. A couple of days after this, the local curate got talking with a few teenagers at a bus stop. And at the end of the conversation said, "How would it be if I left the church open for a couple of hours on Friday evening, and you might like to drop in?" With no pressure and no structure, the church was left open for a couple of hours on Friday evening, and scores of teenagers turned up. They sat in silence, they cried, they lit candles. They had no idea at all, for the most part, of what the church might have said it was there for, and I doubt very much whether they would have known one end of the Nicene Creed from the other. But they had emotions that needed a home, and they knew where there was space for those emotions to go. And in a very, very different way, I recall the last time I stood in this particular place, in this building, for a public commemoration of the death of the late Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh. In all those different parts of our social geography, there are individuals, as there are communities, in need of a space for emotions, fears, regrets, and hopes that won't fit in other places. And that remains a reality, to a surprising extent, in a surprising range of communities. When the council estate in Ely in Cardiff exploded in riots last summer after the tragic death of two teenagers in a police chase, it was the local parish priest who once again opened a space for the community to do something with its feelings other than just set fire to things. It was the local parish priest who negotiated with the police what kind of presence they could and should have in various delicate contexts in the weeks that followed. The community knew perfectly well, at one level, what the church was there for. It was there for their healing. And that might be to push the vocabulary a bit further than they would have wanted it to go, but nonetheless represents a reality. No, not secular yet. Post-Christian, but not forgetful of what the church might be. And more than one parish priest will say, even in these very strained and straitened days for parish ministry, that they've discovered to their surprise what you might call a priest-shaped hole in people's imagination within their communities. That's to say, they've discovered that they are able to step into a kind of gap in people's expectations and people's hopes, which has relatively little to do with traditional doctrinal Christianity, but is not an abstraction or a fiction. A cultural context, then, in which we can say the church continues to provide a space, a cultural context in which that space is something whose relation to belief is uncertain and fluid, but, to underline the point again, not a society in which Richard Dawkins has simply won. What about all those people we read about from time to time who like to describe themselves as spiritual but not religious? I gather that SBNR, spiritual but not religious, is now an agreed shorthand in some kinds of sociological literature. So if you come across it, that's what it means. We're told repeatedly that a growing number of people identify in this way, or sometimes as spiritual but not affiliated, SBNA for reference. Some sociological research has said this is clearly the shape of the future. But I'm not sure it's quite so simple as that. There's certainly an articulate and not negligible portion of mostly a more educated, mostly, interestingly, more male segment of the population identifying in this way. But what the term means has nearly half a dozen varieties in sociological use, and its demographic pattern varies quite a lot across the country. Some people who identify in this way would say they are dissenting from all institutional religion. Some would say they take what they need from institutional religion and don't reject it. Some would say they're on a journey in which institutional religion plays a part coming and going. Some have been described as migrants, that is, moving from one kind of religious climate to another, not sure where they belong. So, to speak of the future of our society as lying with those identifying as spiritual but not religious is perhaps a bit ambitious. It takes for granted, in a way which most of us would find rather problematic, that spiritual is about things that make me feel better, and religious is about having to do things whether they make me feel better or not. Those of us who have grown old in the service of the church will know that doing things, whether they make you feel better or not, is actually what it's all about. But that's never been a great selling point as such. I could say a lot about being Archbishop of Canterbury in that way, but I better pass on. The point is that there's often a rather crude opposition between the individual spiritual search and the collective religious identity, the institution, the community that meets for fixed events. But in practice, that is very seldom so clear-cut, as the breakdown of the different types of spiritual but not religious identity suggest. There are those who see themselves as guests still within a house they're not quite sure how to inhabit, as well as those who are on a driven and very individualized search for a pattern of belief and practice that suits them as individuals only. So, not so straightforward, and also, interestingly, a phenomenon that's mostly confined to English-speaking societies. A lot of other languages just don't have that kind of distinction between spiritual and religious. But that's another story. So, there's my first qualification to the bad news we started with. Post-Christian, maybe even residually Christian, remembering Christianity, recognizing the space it holds open, even if you don't know quite why, being willing, at least to some extent, to be a casual beneficiary of a tradition you don't completely own for yourself. All of this is, I won't say a predominant social pattern, but nonetheless a widespread and recognizable one. But I want, in the next bit of my reflection, to talk about three aspects of the contemporary scene, which in fact go a little bit further than the more general reflections I've just shared with you. Three areas which might be significant turning points and growing points in the relation of the Christian community to the society around it. And the first of these has to do with the dissolution of the old science and religion battle. With due respect to Richard Dawkins, this doesn't seem to be a ditch that anybody very much wants to die in any longer. About 10 years ago, I was invited to go and give a talk to a sixth form in Cambridge, a rather terrifyingly good school where I knew I'd have all sorts of exceptionally difficult questions to answer. And they asked me to speak about science and religion, and we had a reasonable evening with some quite good questions. But as I was going out, one of the parents came up to me and said, "That was all very well, but that's not what they're really worried about, you know. The reason people were reluctant to explore, let alone identify with Christianity, had little or nothing to do with the sense of incompatibility between religion and a scientific worldview. It did have quite a lot to do with what I mentioned earlier, the perception of what the church was against, not least in sexual ethics." So, to comment on the relative disappearance of the old-style science and religion debate is not unqualified good news for the church. It doesn't mean we're out of the wood exactly, because there are plenty of other things people find difficult. But it is a little bit of a tectonic shift. It's fascinating to see how many serious and younger research scientists, whether or not they share Christian faith, are perfectly comfortable with saying that there is no contradiction, no battle to the death between their worldview and the view of faith. And that has a lot to do with the way in which more sophisticated scientists are recognizing how much they have been in thrall to a 19th century picture of science, which is all about the delivery of neat and final solutions with incontrovertible proofs. If you use phrases like that to the average modern physicist, he or she will laugh mirthlessly. Science itself has moved on dramatically and intriguingly towards a more imaginative, organic, relational, and open-ended set of patterns. Some of you may have read the books of that brilliant Italian popularizer of modern physics, Carlo Rovelli. A recent book on white holes is worth looking at there. Rovelli does not describe himself as a religious believer, and yet goes out of his way in his wonderfully readable little books on modern physics to speak about how the best analogue for his own relation to his work and his vision is a religious one. He understands ideas of wonder, of awe, the excitement of discovery, the sense of perspective on the smallness of human life in very religious terms, and is very prepared to engage in debate and discussion with those who'd call themselves theologians. But in addition to that, you have a number of slightly maverick scientific writers, people like Rupert Sheldrake and Ian McGilchrist, who have poured their research skills at a level of great sophistication into dismantling more and more comprehensively the ideas of a materialist, deterministic world, and certainly in the case of Ian McGilchrist, have changed the way we think about thinking. In other words, one of the cultural trump cards that was occasionally played by secularists of an older generation doesn't quite seem to work in the way it did. You can't simply say there is a standoff here in which there's one party with a set of clearly defined ideas about proof and certainty, and another depending on faith and authority. Contemporary scientists are well aware of the way faith and authority work in their own scientific research, and are, I think it's fair to say, deeply suspicious of the claims of absolute certainty that many of their scientific predecessors would have taken for granted. More and more, in the science and religion conversation, discussions show a convergent pattern, shared interests, a concern to do justice to a world which is mysteriously more intelligent, more universally and uniformly communicative than anybody ever expected. A world in which interdependence, you might even say communion, has come to matter at a much deeper level. And one final comment, again, a personal note. I've been involved in the last 3 years in an interdisciplinary research group looking at what religion and ethics might say to and hear from the world of artificial intelligence research. And I've been struck again and again by how practitioners in that world are, in fact, eager to engage with theologians and philosophers about the nature of knowledge, the nature of the self, even the soul, the nature of the universe we live in. So there is one specific area where the assumptions of uniform, rather bland secularity seem to have faded. The second area is one that's in some ways even more difficult to pin down and even more, what should I say, at its beginnings, and yet, I think, potentially very important indeed. And here is the name drop of the evening. When I was talking to Nick Cave last year, I don't talk to lots of rock stars, but I do remember it when I do. One of the things that he said was that 5 or 6 years earlier, if he had at a London dinner party mentioned that he had a religious faith, there would either have been an embarrassed silence or a hostile pile-on. Now, he said, if I talk about this, people want to hear more. All of this was in the wake of Nick Cave publishing a very extraordinary book called Faith, Hope and Carnage, which was a series of conversations about his experience, his dramatic career in popular music with all the things that usually go with it, his traumatic personal life, including the tragic death of a teenage son. And when we were speaking for an interview for one of the Sunday papers last year, when we were speaking, he underlined the fact that his experience of traumatic loss had intensified rather than weakened his sense of the importance of religious commitment. He said, "I was determined not to let the suffering have the last word." I was determined not to let the suffering have the last word. Nick is now a regular churchgoer and communicant, and somebody who is quite clearly open about his commitment to Christianity, and Christianity of a relatively old-fashioned kind. That's to say, he goes to Holy Communion and believes the words of the Creed. I don't say that's exceptional, but it's perhaps not as much to be taken for granted as it once was. The point being that for him, this is not simply a space in which to put something. It's a shape into which his life is being conformed. And there's the difference. Many people are grateful for the space, and rightly so. But there are others who feel that their feelings, their thoughts are, as it were, expanding to fit that space, taking on the shape, should we say, of discipleship in the process. And looking around at a number of figures who are celebrated and influential in worlds like that of Nick Cave, the world of popular music, the world of political and especially environmental activism, it's remarkable to see a significant number of influential figures following him or echoing him in openness about their Christian commitment. Paul Kingsnorth, novelist, poet, environmental advocate, a couple of years ago announced that he had decided to be received into the Orthodox Church. I had the privilege of doing a most intriguing podcast with him a year or two ago in which he talked about his journey towards that kind of faith. And he's not the only person who has looked towards a very traditional form of Christian liturgy and discipleship as a source of real inspiration and imaginative energy in his work as an artist and an activist. Closer to home, again, thinking of the Eastern Orthodox Church, I had a conversation some months ago with one of the Russian Orthodox clergy in Cardiff, who spoke with some puzzlement about the number of unattached young men who were turning up from the outer bits of West Cardiff to the liturgy on Sunday mornings, looking for a shape, looking for, should I say, a melody almost to sing, something with body to it, something with conviction to it. At its least helpful, I suppose you see that reflected in the phenomenon of that remarkable Canadian guru, Jordan Peterson, associated with a variety of rather odd right-wing attitudes and very much a hero for a certain kind of younger man. Not one of my favorite people, but it reflects at least that turn to and questioning about identity in a confused world. At best, I think it's reflected in the surfacing, the rising to the surface of Christian themes and images in unexpected places, in imaginative literature, in the novels of somebody like Marilynne Robinson, arguably the finest novelist writing in the United States these days. It's reflected in the philosophy of Charles Taylor, again, arguably the finest social philosopher in the English-speaking world and a very devoted Roman Catholic. Or the French philosopher Bruno Latour, now departed, but whose last work was effectively an appeal to the church to step forward more boldly into the intellectual space that he felt was opening up in the intellectual world of France. And that is saying something. So that's my second growing point or turning point. There's a surprising number of people there who do seem to understand that beneath all the institutional nonsense and the online battles which Christians like others fight so disedifyingly and constantly, there is actually food and drink to be had in the traditional worship and categories of the church. One very atheistical reviewer in the United Kingdom, discussing one of Marilynne Robinson's novels, I mentioned her a moment ago, said that for the first time he realized that Christianity was something you could think with. Christianity was something you could think with. In other words, it is a tool for making sense, making adult, resourceful, resonant sense. And thirdly, more briefly and sketchily, I think that all has something to do with the fact that what you might call the macro images of the church, the big pictures of the church in media and communication, including the high-profile debates we're all involved in, may lead, and in some ways do lead, a number of people to refocus on the local sense of Christian community, the local resources of Christian community, and to find them open and welcoming. We're back here a little bit to what I said earlier about people finding a space in the church, but it's also a lot to do with the way in which the church creates and maintains that space in its witness. If the churches involved in the organization of food banks around the United Kingdom were to close there would be perhaps 10% of the existing food banks still functioning. And debating some years ago with Richard Dawkins on the social presence of religion, I found that in the argument, just in a student union context, the argument that carried most weight with a lot of the audience, the religious side won, I'm happy to say, the argument that carried most weight was precisely that sense of a creative and energized presence in caring for the community and its common good. People get bored with public debate, with public warfare, and online controversy. They are less bored when they see lives they know being touched. And that remains true, and in some parts of our society is perhaps more true even than it was 20 years ago. So there are my 3 possible growing points. And to wrap this up as briefly as I can, I don't think there are any obvious prescriptions here for strategies, but a situation that suggests some directions in which we think. Mission strategies have their place, and I believe that with absolute sincerity. It's important that we think about how we conserve our resources, important that we think about priorities in outreach, important that we take responsibility for maintaining what we have and sharing it efficiently. At the same time, again and again, people's experience is that while that is going on, what draws unexpected people in is what I'd like to call the thick texture of Christian practice. A sense of worthwhileness, a sense that the commitment, the energy, and the excellence of what is done in a church is in itself an argument. Christianity is something to think with. Even more, it's something to feel and live and look with. Something that fills out human possibilities. And that thick texture of practice, that confidence in the worthwhileness of what we do and say, especially in worship, is something we need to go on investing in every way possible. It's been pointed out, quite truly, that in the last few years, perhaps a bit less so after the pandemic, but in recent years, attendance at cathedrals is one of the success stories in many areas of England and Wales, partly because of that sense of a dense texture of tradition and practice, a worthwhile enterprise which takes time because worthwhile things take time. Not every church can be or ought to be a cathedral. But what's striking is that very modest local enterprises attract in the same way. They may, of course, appeal through deliberate and targeted outreach, but they also appeal through that sense of being a place where roots are put down, worthwhile enterprises are conducted, lives are laid open. So, in the years ahead, can we be hopeful about the future of the church? That's actually a fairly simple question at the end of the day because, as I like to say, because of God, basically. The church exists because God wants it to. God hasn't changed his mind, and so the church will continue. That's the bottom line. Exactly how it will continue and what it's going to look like is by no means such an easy question. And it's not going to be a painless matter. But if we do begin with that kind of confidence, we may perhaps shed that air of oppressive anxiety that can so often creep into our discussion of the future and our strategizing for the future. We may learn a bit more how to make the most of what cultural visibility we still have, to make the friends and have the conversations that we are perhaps more able to have now than 20 or 30 years ago even. We need to be aware of the risks of binding the gospel to one side or another of a current conflict. We need to think about our good news as good news because it is good to think and to feel with. The space is still there for us in the culture. The hunger, the appetite has not disappeared. For all the prejudice and the ignorance that surrounds us, for all the low-key cultural hostility we may face in certain contexts, the hunger not only for a space, but for a shape for our thoughts and feelings remains. And into that, by God's grace, we still have the resources to speak. And God help us to do so. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for a lecture, a talk which went in so many directions, but fundamentally into a deep faith and hope that Christianity is present because God wants it to be, and the church is here because God wants that to be. That's an encouraging thought, and not least that cathedrals are at the forefront of mission and growth, which I'm quite pleased about. There is some time for some questions. If anybody has an immediate question, we can go straight to it. Alternatively, we can just buzz amongst your neighbour about just what struck you, and that might shape a few questions. Are there any immediate ones? Well, if you're like me, you just need to just turn to your neighbour for 2 minutes and just chat about what you've heard, what sparked you, and then we'll come back together when a question has shaped. If we'd like to come back together, I see questions have now emerged straight away. I shall be the roving microphone, and if you'd like to speak into it and ask your question.
Thank you very much. I'll stand up so everybody can see who the hell it is, if you'll forgive it. Just an observation in a way. I remember from working in two of the most secular, though not necessarily anti-religious institutions in the UK in this diocese, both in further education and in the prison service. And you had to prove yourself as not only as a minister, but as a Christian. And those two things were not necessarily the same thing, certainly in terms of particularly the staff as well as the inmates stroke students. But the one thing that made a difference in the end was for them to see that there was a deep authenticity to what your faith was about, that there was no side, that there was a degree of profound honesty, and the ability to say, do you know what? I haven't got a clue what the answer to your question is. And to admit that. And I wonder whether that is also a way in which the church can actually go forward to look inside itself, not just in terms of structures, but also in terms of how people want us to be, not necessarily just change so that, we change with the wind that blows, but also to understand who we really are in this world. There's a million observations, not a question, I'm sorry.
Thanks, Andrew. And of course, if it were a question, my proper answer would be I have no idea. But in all seriousness, I think you put your finger on something very, very important there in terms of honesty. And I think what people are repelled by in the church is very often a sense of dishonesty. We've tied ourselves up in very often dishonest postures and positions about issues, not least over sexuality. We've tied ourselves up in evasions and dishonesty over the abuse question, and that leaves people feeling utterly stranded, utterly disillusioned. And the other side of it, which I think is the only thing I'd want to say to fill out what you've said, the other side of it is that we of all people ought to be people who are able to say, we failed. And to say, and we are here to say, we failed and failure is not the last word because of God. If we push away the knowledge of our failure and the acknowledgement of our failure, we sort of tell people we don't really believe in God, I think. And I think one of the things that does sometimes come through as authentic is precisely when people say, I failed. Not just I don't know, but I failed. I made a mistake. I learned. I grew. God was faithful. And that's how we show that God is faithful, by talking about failure and renewal, I think. So that's just a note in the margin to what you say. Thank you.
Is there another question? I'm just kind of looking to see if anybody's trying to catch my eye. Right.
As we are in Wales, I'm actually from the north, and what occurs to me when you were talking about the established Orthodox Church. How do you think the nonconformist movement fits into all this? Because I remember we went to Patagonia and they said, well, everywhere we went, we built a chapel every 5 kilometres, but we built another one. And that was so that people could say, that's the one I don't go to. And I hear this so often. All you do in the church is bicker and squabble. Observations.
Yes, thank you. Yes, I've heard the same story told as the joke about the Welshman on the desert island who, when he's rescued, has built 2 chapels. That's the one I go to, and that's the one I wouldn't be seen dead in. Nonconformity, yes. Yes, I confess I've talked mostly about my own Anglican identity and context. But I grew up in the Presbyterian Church of Wales, and I'm very grateful for it. But I think, and I'm going to be a bit bold here, I think one of the aspects of 20th century Welsh church history rather illustrates the problem. The Presbyterian Church of Wales, like the other nonconformist churches, devoted immense amounts of energy to getting the church in Wales disestablished. And when that happened, having known what they were against, they weren't quite sure what they were for. And I think that's perhaps a bit of an object lesson. What if what you're against, what if you get your way? Then what? What's worth doing just because it's worth doing, not because it's bad news for somebody else? Now, that's an unforgivable caricature of the life of Welsh nonconformity in the 20th century, which in so many ways went on producing the most extraordinary, visionary, prophetic, creative presences in Wales, like one of my heroes, Penna Davies of Swansea. Yet there is something in that world which, because of its focus on controversy, has undermined itself a bit, and we're doing the same. what we need to bear in mind, I think, from the nonconformist heritage, and again I'll be bold here, is to remember that our church, the Anglican Church, does exist in its present form because of the Reformation, however Anglo-Catholic we are. It's here like this because of the Reformation. And the nonconformist churches exist largely because we didn't have the imagination to pursue some strands of the Reformation with consistency and courage. A bit more sharing of authority, a bit more transparency, a bit more openness to emotion and enthusiasm and personal appeal. All the things that the Methodist revivals in Wales and England spoke for. People were looking for what the established church didn't provide. And it's important to remember that, and again to say, well, we got some things very badly wrong there. We failed. So to say that the nonconformist story is perhaps one of too much unhappy division is not to say we're necessarily superior there. It's just to say, well, that's the ditch they dug, and we're pretty good at digging our own. But I wouldn't for any money forswear my roots in that tradition to which I owe so much.
Any other questions? There is.
Very quickly, Archbishop, I wonder whether you have anything to say about the fact that during the COVID pandemic, people were encouraged to go on solitary walks with nature, which almost conjures up the idea of the Romantic poets. And following on this, we have a proper Christian concern for the future of God's earth, and also, I'd like to think, the growth of faith in the way of the poet Wordsworth, loving and respecting nature, growing into intimations of immortality, and then gathering to a sense of Christian duty. Would you comment on that, please?
Very happily, yes. Thanks, Andrew.
Sorry.
Yes. I think it's significant that for many people the pandemic was, again, rather unexpectedly, a moment of transparency to something more than getting and spending, to use a Wordsworthian phrase. But I think it's also been my experience that the concern about our environment has proved a very fertile ground for conversation between religion and science, between church and a younger generation, and so on. So I would say there's a lot there to work for. And when I spoke about the new spirit, the new environment in the scientific world, I was thinking very particularly of the way in which somebody like Rupert Sheldrake, who is a practicing Anglican, has talked about understanding the spirit-laden, information-laden, communion-rich nature of the world we live in, and has said he wouldn't have understood that without his exposure to both Christian and non-Christian mystical traditions, and that feeds into his scientific research and worldview. So a lot to unpick there, I think.
There is time perhaps for one final question if anyone is still scratching your head trying to work out how to say it. If you can't quite find the words, just let something come out.
Wonderful to hear you speak. Thank you so much for tonight. I come from East Sussex, where Hastings and Eastbourne, that area, where the King's Church was incredibly successful, full of young people, a band, a drummer, guitarists. When they sang Silent Night, they sang it like a rock song. And I was appalled, I'm afraid, because my church was founded in 1449, All Saints Church, Hastings, and also St. Clement's just 30 years later in the Old Town. And there, just as this wonderful cathedral, you have the tradition going back pre-Reformation. How many people have prayed here? How many people have worshipped? And this continuity is a wonderful thing. And the actual celebration every week, it's the same, and even the old language, where we do still have it in the Nicene Creed, makes us feel very good. There you are, there's the word, just good, about our faith, about our religion. And yet the youngsters, and a lot of older people as well, were getting the same feeling from the King's Church. How does the Anglican community get that buzz as well?
Oh dear.
Thank you. Save the easiest till last.
It's always the case, isn't it? The last question is the one you need half an hour on. I think we deal with it, firstly, by not panicking too easily. People experiment. People find out what works in different settings. I have very little temperamental taste for modern worship, I admit. I accept it speaks to some. I notice it doesn't speak to my own children at all, and to quite a lot of young people. It's not as if there's one size fits all here. And we have to remember that too. There's no magic formula that'll just, spark it. And insofar as there is any common ground here, I've sometimes said it's a matter of looking as if you know what you're doing and love what you're doing, whether it's traditional worship or modern worship. Look as if you know what you're doing and love what you're doing. Meanwhile, I think it's extremely important that people nurture the memory of what has fed them so that it can be passed on. Don't just, tear up the history book. That people don't panic if the things that work for them don't work for others, either way round. That we maintain in the church a spirit of sufficient mutual openness to say, well, I'm willing to learn. Let's see how that impacts on where I am. And our Anglican family is still, at its best, I think, capable of doing that. And I don't by any means despair. I'm just intrigued, as I say, by the sheer variety and unexpectedness of this, and the fact that some people who have been brought to a living faith by communities like the King's Church will feel after a few years they want to put down deeper roots in a tradition and discover something else. And sometimes, of course, people who've been brought up in a very staid Anglican tradition and have walked away rediscover Christianity through the excitement of something very different. And in the providence of God, so long as it's all leading to the cross and resurrection of Jesus Christ and to trust in God the Holy Trinity and a life of faith, hope and love, well, really, I'm not complaining.
Thank you so much for not only your talk, which in itself took us to places which enriched the subject area, but the way you've engaged with the questions as well and taken those into a much deeper place is something you're known for and is characteristic of your style, and we've benefited from it this evening. Extremely grateful to you for coming to give this lecture. Please give Dr. Williams another really big round of applause.